He woke up every morning before the sun, not because he had to, but because his body no longer understood sleep the way it once did. Years of early calls and sudden alarms had trained him that way. Even now, in his small rented house on a quiet street, his eyes opened before the alarm ever rang. He lay still for a moment, listening. The house was silent, except for the soft hum of the old refrigerator and the faint sound of his child breathing in the next room. That sound mattered more to him than anything else in the world. It meant the night had passed peacefully. It meant another day had begun without trouble. He got out of bed slowly, careful not to make noise. The floor creaked in one corner, and he stepped around it from habit. He had learned long ago that small sounds could matter. Some habits never leave, no matter how much time passes. In the kitchen, he brewed cheap coffee and stood by the window while it dripped. Outside, the street looked ordinary. A neighbor's car with peeling paint. A stray cat crossing the road. A trash bin tipped slightly to one side. Nothing special. That was exactly how he liked it. On the table sat a folded school paper with crayon drawings on it. Bright colors. A stick figure holding another smaller stick figure by the hand. Above them was a crooked sun, and a word written carefully. Dad. He picked it up and smiled. Just a little. Raising a child alone was not easy, but it gave his life shape, purpose. Every decision he made now was simple. Was it safe? Was it honest? Would it help his child grow up better than he had? He packed a lunch, nothing fancy. Bread, fruit, a small note with a smiley face drawn on it. He wasn't good with words when it came to feelings, but he tried. Every day he tried. After breakfast, he walked his child to the bus stop. Other parents stood nearby, talking about weather, bills, and school events. He nodded politely, but didn't join in much. People saw him as quiet, maybe a little distant, but kind. Someone who kept to himself. No one asked about his past. He never offered it. Once the bus pulled away, he stood for a second longer, watching until it disappeared around the corner. Only then did he turn and walk toward his own job. He worked maintenance at a large community center not far away. The job paid just enough. It came with no attention and no pressure. Fixing broken doors, cleaning floors, carrying boxes. Simple work with clear results. When something was broken, he fixed it. When something was dirty, he cleaned it. There was comfort in that. His coworkers respected him. They noticed he was always on time, that he never complained, that he could fix almost anything without much talk. If there was a heavy load to lift, he handled it alone. If there was a problem late in the day, he stayed until it was done. They didn't know why he moved the way he did. Calm, alert, always aware of who entered a room and where the exits were. They just thought it was part of his personality. Sometimes, during quiet moments, his mind drifted. A sound would echo a little too sharply. A door would slam, and his muscles would tense for a split second before he relaxed again. He hated those moments, not because of fear, but because they reminded him of a life he worked hard to leave behind. At lunch, he sat alone, scrolling through old photos on his phone. Most were of his child, birthdays, first day of school. A messy face covered in ice cream. There were no pictures from his years of service. None at all. He had deleted them long ago. Those memories lived somewhere deeper, locked away. After work, he stopped by the grocery store. He compared prices carefully, choosing store brands, planning meals for the week. He thought ahead. Always ahead. Running out of money was a risk he refused to take. At the checkout, the cashier smiled and asked how his day was. He answered politely, "Good, thank you." Nothing more. Nothing less. In the evening, he helped with homework at the small kitchen table. Math problems. Reading practice. He listened carefully, patient even when the answers came slowly. He never rushed. He knew the value of steady guidance. Later, they ate dinner together and watched a cartoon. He didn't really watch it, but he laughed at the right moments. The sound of his child's laughter filled the room, and for him, that sound meant safety. It meant life had given him a second chance. After bedtime, he washed dishes and checked the locks on the doors, once, then twice. He told himself once was enough, but he checked again anyway. Old habits. He sat on the couch and stared at the wall for a while. On a small shelf sat a simple wooden box. Inside it were a few items he rarely touched. A worn piece of fabric. A plain metal tag. Nothing that would mean anything to anyone else. He didn't open the box that night. He rarely did. Some days, he wondered if he had done the right thing by disappearing into a quiet life. People from his past had tried to find him once. Not enemies. Fellow veterans. Old connections. He never returned their calls. It wasn't anger. It was choice. He wanted his child to grow up without shadows following them. A week later, a note came home from school. There was a community event coming up. A charity gathering connected to military families. Food, speeches, activities for kids. The child's eyes lit up while explaining it. "Can we go?" The child asked. He hesitated. Crowds made him uneasy. Uniforms even more so. Questions always followed those. Where did you serve? What did you do? Why did you leave? But he looked at the hopeful face in front of him and nodded. Yes, we can go. The day of the event, he wore plain clothes. Clean jeans. A simple shirt. Nothing that stood out. He kept his posture relaxed, shoulders slightly rounded, as if to make himself smaller. The place was busy. Flags, booths, laughter, children running around. Veterans greeting each other with familiar warmth. Some wore medals. Some told stories loudly, hands moving in the air. He stayed close to his child, letting them explore while keeping watch from a short distance. His eyes scanned automatically. Exits, corners, elevated spots. He hated that he did it, but he couldn't stop. A few people noticed him. Not because of how he dressed, but because of how he watched. Calm, focused, like someone standing guard without realizing it. A man nearby joked about how quiet he was. Someone else asked if he had served. He answered with a short nod. Yes, a long time ago. They smiled and moved on, satisfied with that. He felt a familiar tension in his chest. Not fear, just awareness. He reminded himself he was safe. His child was laughing nearby. There was music playing. Nothing bad was happening. He took a slow breath and let it out. He didn't know that this simple choice, made for his child's happiness, would pull a part of his past back into the light. He didn't know that words he had not spoken in years would soon leave his mouth. He only knew that, for now, he was just a single dad trying to live quietly. And for the moment, that was enough. He followed his child through the crowd, careful to keep a hand on the small shoulder when things got busy. The event was lively. Booths were decorated with balloons and banners. Children ran back and forth, clutching small prizes. Volunteers handed out snacks and guided people to tables. Music played from a speaker in the corner, a soft background beat that made everything feel cheerful. He stayed quiet, blending in. He liked blending in. It had been years since he had been part of a crowd that knew nothing about him. Here, he could be invisible. Here, he could just be a dad. That's all. His child dragged him toward a table where some of the volunteers were setting up a small game. A few other kids were already playing, tossing rings onto bottles and laughing whenever they missed. He knelt to help his child understand the rules. You want to stand a little closer, he said softly, pointing. Take your time. His voice was calm, patient, natural. His child smiled and listened. Every small victory mattered. Every small lesson felt important. While they played, he noticed someone standing at the edge of the room who seemed different from the rest. The man wore a neat uniform, decorated with patches and insignia. His posture was relaxed, but carried weight, the kind of presence that made people pay attention, even when they didn't know why. A few people approached him with respect, nodding and laughing at something he said. The single dad didn't pay it much attention at first. He had seen many military figures in his life. Some were polite. Some were loud. Most were busy with their own lives. This one, he thought, was just another high-ranking officer. He had no interest in standing out, no desire to be recognized. But as the event went on, he noticed the man's eyes scanning the crowd. Not in a searching way. More like someone who notices details naturally, without thinking. Eyes flicking over people, catching small movements. Taking in expressions. At one point, the man spoke to a group of veterans near a display of old military equipment. They laughed at something he said, then clapped him on the shoulder. The single dad caught a glimpse of admiration in their eyes. It was subtle, but it was there. He moved his child toward a table with snacks, letting the crowd flow around them. A volunteer handed them small paper plates with cookies and fruit. His child offered him a cookie. He smiled faintly and took it. Simple moments like this grounded him. They reminded him why he left the chaos of his old life behind. Later, a speaker began to address the crowd. The voice was warm, inviting everyone to enjoy the evening and thanking all the veterans and their families for attending. People applauded politely. He clapped, not because of obligation, but because he respected anyone who served. He had no desire for attention himself. After the speech, people began mingling. Conversations flowed about family, school, work, and memories of service. Some laughed loudly, others quietly reminisced. The single dad stayed near the edges, observing, listening, letting his child wander with some supervision. Then, the uniformed man approached a small group where the single dad was standing. He noticed the quiet figure, the man who didn't seem to want attention, and he smiled. The smile was casual, friendly, disarming. You served, yes? The man asked, his voice light, almost teasing. What was your call sign? The single dad's eyes flicked briefly toward him. Call sign. That one word carried weight he had tried to leave behind. In his world, a call sign was not just a name. It was identity, history, and responsibility all wrapped together. Some called signs were known widely in the service community. Others were kept secret, even after the missions were complete. He hesitated. The question felt harmless enough, like a joke, but there was a tension beneath it he could sense immediately. The uniformed man wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. He was friendly, casual, joking. Yet even so, the weight of his own past pressed against him. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The small crowd around them waited briefly, sensing the pause but not understanding it. The words hovered in his mind. He could give a fake one, something harmless, something that would keep the past buried. Or he could tell the truth, which carried consequences he hadn't faced in years. The child tugged gently at his sleeve, unaware of the tension, asking something about the cookie they had just eaten. He smiled faintly at the innocence. That small gesture reminded him why he had left the past behind. To protect this child. To protect the life they had now. The man in uniform chuckled at the pause, thinking it part of the polite hesitation. Come on, just a fun answer, he said lightly. I don't bite. I've heard some wild ones. The single dad's jaw tightened for a moment. He had heard countless wild stories. Names that were jokes, names that were legends. He had seen both types, some entertaining, some terrifying. He had survived because of caution, and because he respected the weight of those names. Finally, after a deep breath, he answered quietly, almost under his voice, "Iron Ghost." The room went still. Not an exaggeration. Conversations slowed. Laughter paused. Even his child noticed something and looked up, eyes wide. The uniformed man froze mid-smile. His eyebrows rose. He had expected a joke, a light-hearted name. Not this. Not the call sign that belonged to whispered stories of missions that very few knew about. Not the name that carried respect and fear in equal measure. There was a long moment of silence, and in that moment, the single dad felt a strange sensation. Not pride, not shame, just the weight of recognition. The past was no longer buried. It existed here, in this room, in the eyes of this man who was supposed to be joking. Other veterans around started to glance toward him, sensing the shift in energy. They did not know him, but some had heard the stories. Legends passed quietly among those who had served. Whispers began to spread like a ripple through the room. The uniformed man took a slow breath and looked directly at him, eyes wide with a mixture of astonishment and respect. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, unsure how to respond. The joke he intended had evaporated. The single dad looked down for a moment, keeping his expression neutral. He didn't want praise. He didn't want attention. He had lived this long without it, and he preferred it that way. But the man in uniform nodded slowly, a subtle but unmistakable gesture, a recognition that said more than words ever could, a respect that was earned, not demanded. He stepped back slightly, giving the single dad space, letting him remain quiet and unassuming. It was enough. That nod, that moment of understanding, spoke volumes. The crowd slowly resumed its activity, but the energy had shifted. Conversations became quieter, respectful. People glanced briefly, sensing that someone extraordinary was among them. Though they didn't understand, why the child tugged at his hand again, asking a question about the next activity. He smiled softly, bending down to answer. The simple joy of the child reminded him why he was here, why he had chosen anonymity all these years. This was life. This was peace. Yet even as they moved toward the next booth, the single dad felt a subtle change within himself. The past he had carried quietly, locked away for years, had resurfaced. Not as a threat, not as danger, but as acknowledgement. A recognition from someone who understood the weight of what Iron Ghost meant. He realized that some things, no matter how deeply buried, find a way to emerge when the time is right. Sometimes it comes in a quiet room. Sometimes it comes through the innocent eyes of a child. Sometimes it comes as a joke that turns serious in an instant. He didn't speak again about it. Not yet, not to anyone. He simply moved through the event with his child, participating in the games and laughter. But the air around him had changed. He could feel it in the glances, in the energy, in the subtle shift of respect. And he understood something else, too. That recognition didn't change who he was. It didn't force him back into a life he had left. It only reminded him that his actions, quiet or loud, mattered more than he had ever admitted by the time the evening ended. He walked out holding his child's hand, just like he had arrived. Simple, ordinary, unnoticed by most. Yet the world had changed slightly in that one small circle. He knew it. The uniformed man knew it. And perhaps, in some quiet way, the child understood that their dad carried more than just the weight of daily life. That night, when they returned home, he sat quietly, reflecting. He had told the truth. Just 2 words, simple and short. Yet those words had rippled farther than he expected. He had lived quietly, but the past had found a way to reach him, and in that moment, he realized that some truths cannot remain hidden forever, And some recognition, no matter how late, comes not as applause, but as understanding. A quiet, deep, unspoken respect that lingers long after the words have been spoken. The single dad felt the weight of every eye that had turned toward him after he said the words. He didn't move. He didn't smile. He just stood there, calm on the outside, while his mind replayed decades of life in a flash. Each memory was sharp and clear. The missions, the long nights, the fear, the moments that tested every part of him. Yet here, in this small hall filled with balloons, music, and laughter, those memories felt surreal. He could feel the uniformed man's gaze on him, steady, evaluating, aware. Not judgmental, not questioning, just taking measure of the truth he had spoken. Iron Ghost. A name that had meant so much to so few now rested quietly on his lips, acknowledged without ceremony, but recognized fully by someone who understood. Around them, whispers rose softly, not loud enough to break the flow of the event, but there. The veterans nearby exchanged subtle glances. Some were nods of quiet understanding. Others were surprised looks that spoke of admiration. To those who knew, a call sign like that was not just a nickname. It was a life, a reputation, a record of endurance and courage. He shifted slightly to glance at his child, who was oblivious to the tension. They were focused on a small craft table, coloring with crayons and laughing at their own messy creations. The simplicity of the child's world grounded him. That laughter, untainted by the weight of the adult world, reminded him why he had chosen to leave the old life behind. No medals, no stories, no recognition, just peace and the small victories of daily life. But the uniformed man stepped closer. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he studied him, tilting his head slightly, a faint frown of concentration on his face. Then he spoke, careful, deliberate. I didn't expect that. The words were not an insult. They were not disbelief. They were recognition. The single dad nodded once, acknowledging the truth of the statement without elaboration. He didn't need to explain. He never had. Around them, life carried on. Children ran past with balloons. Volunteers distributed small prizes, and the music continued playing. Yet there was a subtle shift in energy near them. People unconsciously gave more space, more respect, without fully understanding why. Presence and history carried weight, even when unspoken. The uniformed man finally spoke again, this time with quiet awe. You were part of missions few even know about. He let the sentence hang, not finishing it. He didn't need to. The single dad didn't flinch, didn't confirm. That part of him had never been for public knowledge. Instead, he simply nodded once. That gesture was enough. It said, yes, that was the life I lived. That was the man I had been. But it wasn't who I am now. The uniformed man glanced down at the child coloring, then back at him. There was a brief pause where the adult world and the present collided. The man understood something crucial without being told. This life, quiet and simple, mattered as much as any mission. And it was fragile, delicate, to be protected. What you've done, the uniformed man said softly, doesn't just stay in history books or reports. People carry it in ways they don't always notice. Lives changed, actions remembered, even if the world never sees it. The single dad felt the words settle over him. He didn't need applause. He didn't want it. Recognition was dangerous, or at least it had been. But this acknowledgement, quiet and deliberate, grounded him. It was enough. Respect without spectacle. Understanding without explanation. He looked back toward his child and smiled faintly. Not a proud smile, not triumphant. Just one that said, I'm here. I'm present. I am the person I need to be now. The uniformed man nodded, as if understanding completely, and stepped back slightly. He let the moment pass, giving the single dad room to be a father, to be a man quietly living his life. Other veterans began to gravitate subtly toward different parts of the room. Some looked back, a brief glance of recognition. Some whispered to one another, exchanging silent signals that spoke of past connections and shared understanding. They didn't approach him directly. He didn't invite it. That wasn't his way. He had spent years avoiding attention, and that habit had saved him more times than he could count. The child suddenly ran to him with a drawing. "Look, Dad," they shouted, holding up a picture of a sun, a tree, and two stick figures holding hands. He knelt, taking the paper carefully. "That's really good," he said, tone warm, honest, and steady. "I like the way you colored the sun." The child beamed, unaware of the weight in the room, and ran off to show another child. He stayed kneeling for a moment, letting himself just breathe and enjoy the simple scene. In this room of noise, balloons, and laughter, he could almost forget the shadow his past had cast. Almost. The uniformed man approached again, more gently this time. "You carry yourself differently," he said. "Even now. You're calm, but there's something others feel when you walk into a room." He nodded slowly. That was true. Years of being alert, trained to notice every detail, to anticipate danger, to act decisively. It didn't just disappear. But it didn't dominate him anymore either. He had learned to balance it, to let it exist without allowing it to consume him. They spoke quietly, words carefully chosen. The uniformed man wasn't asking for stories. He wasn't demanding recollections. He was simply acknowledging, and that acknowledgement was a rare gift. Many people never received it. He knew that, and he respected it. Around them, other veterans and attendees continued their activities, unaware of the quiet recognition occurring. A child ran past, carrying a balloon. Laughter erupted from the craft table. Volunteers called for kids to line up for snacks. Music played. Normal life continued, and in that normal life, extraordinary truths remained quietly present. The single dad moved toward the snack table with his child, keeping his focus on them. He could feel the subtle eyes of the uniformed man following him, respectful, unobtrusive, allowing him space. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He felt the understanding. It was enough. As the evening went on, he participated in small games, laughed at silly jokes, helped his child with crafts. Every motion was natural, easy, human. Yet beneath it, he felt the quiet presence of the past, acknowledged and respected, hovering like a shadow that brought no threat. Only recognition. When it was time to leave, he gathered his child's hand and walked to the door. The uniformed man approached one last time, offering a nod that spoke volumes. It was not a command. It was not a judgment. It was respect, deep and silent, the kind that didn't require words. Outside, the air was cool, and the street was calm. The child chattered excitedly about everything they had done, their words flowing in a stream of joy and innocence. He smiled faintly, listening, letting the small moments fill the space that the past sometimes occupied. Even as they walked home, he thought about the encounter. Iron Ghost. Just 2 words had shifted the room, altered perceptions, and reminded him that some parts of life cannot be hidden. They persist quietly, waiting for the right moment to be seen. Acknowledged and understood. At home, he placed the child's backpack on the chair and began preparing a small dinner. Simple food, warm, ordinary. It was what he wanted. It was what mattered. As he stirred the food, he thought about the event, the recognition, and the quiet weight of respect he had received. No one cheered. No one clapped. There was no headline, no announcement. But that didn't matter. He had lived through far more extreme attention and far more dangerous consequences. This acknowledgment was different, pure, simple, true. Later, after dinner and bedtime, he sat in the quiet living room, reflecting. He allowed himself a small smile. He had lived through the past. He had carried the weight of service and identity alone for years. And tonight, in a small, ordinary room filled with ordinary people, someone had seen him. Truly seen him. That was enough. Recognition without spectacle. Understanding without explanation. A moment that mattered far more than any applause or medal. And as he finally rested, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the quiet house, he realized something important. Some truths do not need to be shouted. Some legacies do not need to be celebrated. They only need to be acknowledged, quietly, deeply. And with understanding in that acknowledgement, he found peace. The single dad woke the next morning to sunlight filtering through the blinds. The small house was quiet, the kind of quiet that allowed thoughts to settle. He had replayed the previous night in his mind more than once. The call sign, the nod, the understanding, it was all there, lingering in a way that felt almost unreal. He poured coffee into a chipped mug and sat by the kitchen table, looking out at the street. Children walked to school. Neighbors tended their yards. Life went on, ordinary and calm, and yet a small part of him felt unsettled. Recognition had found him. He didn't dwell on it long. Life needed attention. Breakfast, lunch packed for school. A quick check to make sure bills were paid. The small details of living a simple life had a rhythm he had come to rely on. Even the past, momentous as it was, couldn't dominate these responsibilities. Later that day, he found himself back at the community center. It had become routine to help with maintenance, but today he noticed a shift. People seemed to glance at him differently. Not with suspicion, not with curiosity, but with subtle respect. He didn't seek it. He didn't acknowledge it. He simply worked, moving through his tasks methodically, sweeping floors, tightening screws, and repairing broken doors. The uniformed man from the previous evening appeared again, this time standing near a group of veterans by a display of historical photographs. Their conversation had paused when he arrived, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The single dad kept his distance, but he could feel the man's eyes on him. He knew the recognition wasn't going to fade immediately. It wasn't the kind of thing that left with the sun. After finishing a repair, he moved toward the refreshments table, refilling water bottles for a few veterans who had gathered there. They thanked him politely. No one mentioned the previous night, and he was grateful for that. He preferred life to move forward, simple and unremarkable. Yet he sensed that his presence carried more weight than before. Even if no one said it aloud, the uniformed man approached him quietly. "You were quiet last night," he said. "But everyone noticed. Some people are still talking about it." He smiled faintly, not mockingly, but in a way that conveyed understanding. The single dad nodded, not because he wanted to explain, but because he understood the point. He didn't seek fame or acknowledgement, but recognition, even subtle, had a way of finding him. He had lived with it long enough to know that it couldn't always be ignored. "You carry it well," the uniformed man continued. "Not everyone could handle it." The words were simple, but they held weight. He understood the meaning. He didn't respond with praise or humility. He just nodded again, the silent acknowledgement enough for both of them. Later, the uniformed man asked if he could speak privately for a moment. The single dad agreed, following him to a quieter corner of the hall. They stood facing each other, and the uniformed man finally spoke with gravity. "You know why I asked about the call sign last night?" he began. "It wasn't a joke. Well, it was meant lightly, but I wanted to see the reaction. Most people give a made-up name or a smile, but you didn't. You said the truth." He listened, aware that words carried a weight that actions often did not. Iron Ghost had never been just a name. It was a record, a promise, a set of actions and decisions that very few could understand. It was his history, and for years he had lived quietly, avoiding attention. Yet here, someone had acknowledged it without pressure or ceremony. "You don't realize," the uniformed man said, "how rare that is. Most who carry such a past either hide or they brag. You did neither. You simply exist." The single dad shifted his gaze to the floor for a moment. He didn't need accolades. He didn't need stories told. He needed quiet. He needed his child. He needed to live a life that wasn't defined by the past. But the recognition was still comforting. Not in a way that made him proud, but in a way that felt like understanding deep and true. The uniformed man continued. People who know the name, who know the history, they're aware of what it took to survive, what it took to endure. And they respect it. Not because of fame, not because of ceremony, but because of truth. The single dad finally looked up. Their eyes met, and for a moment there were no words. Just understanding. Years of experience, missions completed, decisions made under impossible conditions, all acknowledged silently. No applause, no speeches, no accolades. Just respect. Around them, the event continued. Children laughed, volunteers guided games, and veterans discussed everyday matters. Life went on, ordinary and unremarkable. And yet, in that small corner, something extraordinary had been quietly recognized. After a pause, the uniformed man spoke again, softer this time. "I want you to know that what you've done and what you carry, it matters. Not to everyone, not to the world, but it matters. And it has left its mark." The single dad felt the truth of the words. It wasn't about recognition from the masses. It wasn't about medals or headlines. It was about acknowledgement from someone who understood, someone who had lived through extremes themselves. That acknowledgement carried more weight than any public ceremony could. He nodded once, allowing the weight of understanding to settle. He didn't need more. He had spent years carrying the past alone, and this quiet recognition was enough. The uniformed man stepped back, giving him space, but the presence lingered. It was a reminder that some truths could not remain hidden forever, that some actions, even in silence, left a mark on the world and on those who understood. As the event wound down, he walked through the crowd with his child, guiding them gently through the maze of tables and balloons. People smiled at them, but no one approached with questions or attention. Life had returned to ordinary rhythm, yet the subtle energy of respect followed him like a shadow. He noticed a few veterans, casting discreet glances in his direction, and he recognized some curiosity, some awareness, but no intrusion. That balance was perfect. The world could acknowledge him quietly, without disturbing the life he had built. That was how he wanted it. When the event ended, he left with his child's hand firmly in his own. The air outside was cool and calm, carrying the sense of the neighborhood, the quiet sounds of evening settling in. The child chattered happily about their day, completely unaware of the weight in their father's presence. He smiled faintly, letting the simple moments fill him. Life was fragile. Life was ordinary. And sometimes recognition came not in grand gestures, but in quiet understanding. Back at home, he sat in the living room after putting his child to bed. The house was silent, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a car passing by. He reflected on the events, the acknowledgement, the subtle respect that had been offered. It was different from anything he had experienced in his past life. No danger, no chaos, just understanding. He reached for a small wooden box on the shelf, one he rarely opened. Inside were items from a life he had left behind: worn pieces of fabric, a few photographs, nothing flashy. He didn't touch them often, but tonight he allowed himself a glance. Memories stirred, but they were tempered by the quiet recognition he had received. It was enough. Somewhere deep down, he realized that this understanding didn't change who he was. It didn't force him back into the chaos of missions or decisions made in the dark. It simply acknowledged that the life he had lived and the choices he had made mattered to someone who understood. That was enough. As he finally lay down to rest, the soft weight of acknowledgement settled over him. Not pride, not triumph, just peace. A quiet understanding that some truths, some actions, some lives, even when lived quietly, leave a mark. And some people, even in the ordinary course of life, can recognize it without fanfare, without ceremony, without words that shout. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel that he was seen. Truly seen. Not for what he could do now, not for what he was in this ordinary life, but for what he had been. And that recognition, quiet and unspoken, gave him a calm he had almost forgotten existed. He realized that sometimes respect doesn't need applause. It doesn't need headlines or celebration. Sometimes it is enough to be acknowledged, understood, and allowed to continue quietly, with the weight of the past balanced by the simplicity of the present. And in that balance, he found peace. The morning began quietly, the kind of morning where the sun rose slowly and the air smelled faintly of dew and wood smoke. The single dad moved through his routine like always, waking early, brewing coffee, and checking that his child had everything ready for school. He watched the sunlight spread across the small kitchen table, illuminating the crayon drawings that were still scattered from yesterday. Each one seemed to glow with innocence, reminding him that life, though complicated, was simple in its most important ways. The events from the previous evening lingered in his mind like a shadow he couldn't shake. The words "Iron Ghost" had been spoken aloud, not as a boast, not as a call for attention, but as truth. And the nod, the understanding, the quiet respect from the uniformed man had left a deep impression. For the first time in years, he felt that his past and present could coexist without conflict. Recognition had arrived, but it had not demanded more than he was willing to give. After sending his child off to school, he lingered for a moment at the front door, feeling the morning breeze on his face. The quiet streets reminded him of the peace he had chosen, the life he had built. For years, he had moved carefully through the world, keeping his past hidden. Today, he could carry it openly, quietly, without fear. That was a subtle but powerful realization. He arrived at the community center later that day, ready to begin his work. The place was still busy with volunteers preparing for a small training seminar. Tables were set, chairs arranged, and equipment checked. He moved among the people methodically, fixing minor issues, making small adjustments. It was routine, familiar, grounding. Yet, underneath the calm, he could sense something shifting. There was a subtle awareness around him, a quiet acknowledgement of who he had been. Though no one spoke directly, the uniformed man from the previous evening appeared again, standing near the seminar tables. He watched quietly, allowing the single dad to work without interruption. When he finally approached, there was no fanfare, no awkward tension. He spoke simply, without raising his voice. "I wanted to say something more," the man said. "Not for others to hear, not for ceremony, just for you to know. You've lived a life that few understand, and you've done it without seeking attention. That matters." The single dad listened quietly. He didn't need validation. He didn't need medals or praise. But the words settled over him like a gentle weight, a reminder that his choices, though made in silence, had left a mark. He nodded once, a subtle acknowledgement of shared understanding around them. Life continued. Volunteers moved between tables. Children laughed in the distance. and the hum of everyday activity filled the room. Yet there was a layer of awareness now, subtle but unmistakable. Those who knew the stories, who understood even a fraction of what Iron Ghost meant, recognized the presence of someone extraordinary. Not because he flaunted it, but because it emanated naturally from him. The uniformed man stepped back slightly, giving him space, but his eyes held a quiet intensity. "Some people never get this," he said softly. "They live their lives without acknowledgement. You've carried your past well, quietly, honestly. That's rare." The single dad didn't reply immediately. He let the words sit. They weren't praise. They were understanding. And that understanding was far more valuable than anything public recognition could provide. It reminded him that what he had done mattered, even if it was never celebrated. Later in the day, he guided his child through a small educational activity at the community center. They worked on a simple craft project, cutting shapes and pasting them onto colored paper. The child's laughter and concentration grounded him, pulling him fully into the moment. These ordinary experiences were the ones he cherished the most. They were life itself, simple and honest, untouched by the weight of the past. Still, he could feel the uniformed man's presence nearby, observing without intruding. The man understood the balance between recognition and respect, knowing that some truths needed to exist quietly, acknowledged but not exploited. The single dad appreciated that. It was rare to encounter someone who could honor a life without turning it into spectacle. When the seminar concluded, the uniformed man approached him again, this time with a small gesture. He extended a hand, not in ceremony, but in acknowledgement. "You've done more than you realize," he said. "Lives changed, moments saved, actions remembered, all in silence. And that's the hardest kind of heroism." The single dad took the hand briefly, a simple shake, no words needed. The contact was firm, but respectful, a silent promise of understanding. The man nodded, stepped back, and allowed him to return to his work. The gesture left him with a quiet warmth, a reminder that true respect didn't need to be loud. It could exist subtly, deeply, and meaningfully. As the day wore on, he helped pack up materials and checked that everything was in order for the next event. Volunteers thanked him quietly. Some glanced at him with curiosity, sensing there was more to his story than met the eye, though none asked questions. He remained composed, allowing life to proceed at its ordinary pace. Grounded in simplicity, when he returned home that evening, his child ran to him with boundless energy, chattering about the day's events, crafts, and games. He listened attentively, responding with warmth and gentle humor, sharing in the joy and wonder of childhood. In these moments, the weight of past recognition faded, replaced by the immediacy of love, presence, and care. After dinner, they sat together, reading quietly. His child leaned against him, relaxed and safe, unaware of the extraordinary acknowledgement that had followed them through the day. He felt a profound sense of gratitude, not for recognition, not for respect, but for the ordinary life that allowed them to thrive. Later, after putting his child to bed, he sat alone in the living room. The soft hum of the refrigerator filled the quiet space. He reflected on the days past, the acknowledgement, the subtle shifts in energy he had noticed, the words spoken by the uniformed man, the quiet nods, the respect without ceremony. They were extraordinary because they required nothing from him. They simply recognized truth. He reached for the small wooden box on the shelf, one he rarely opened. Inside were tokens of a life lived under extreme circumstances, worn pieces of fabric, old photographs, small reminders of missions completed and challenges overcome. He didn't dwell on them. He merely looked briefly, acknowledging their presence without being consumed by them. They were part of him, but they did not define him now. He realized that his life had come full circle. The past had been acknowledged, quietly, deeply, without demand. The present, with its simplicity and ordinary joys, was secure. His child was safe, the home was calm, and the small acts of daily life continued. And in that balance, he found something rare, peace. Somewhere in the quiet, he understood that recognition doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't require public ceremony or praise. True respect is subtle. It exists in acknowledgement, understanding, and shared comprehension. It can be quiet, but it is powerful. And when it is offered without expectation, it changes something inside the person receiving it. He allowed himself to breathe deeply, feeling the quiet weight of that understanding settle over him. He had lived through chaos, danger, and extremes. He had survived, not for recognition, but because he needed to. And now, in this ordinary home, in the calm of an evening spent with his child, he understood that his life, lived honestly and quietly, had meaning. He stood, walking to the window, watching the night settle over the street. A few lights flickered on in neighboring homes. The soft sound of distant traffic hummed faintly. The world continued, ordinary and calm. And he was a part of it, fully, quietly, seen in ways that mattered not in the end. It wasn't fame or applause that defined him. It was presence. It was love. It was living each day with care, attention, and integrity. And for the first time in a long time, he felt that he had found the perfect balance between the extraordinary past and the ordinary present. He returned to the living room, sitting quietly in the soft light. The day had been long, yet fulfilling. The acknowledgement, the respect, the quiet understanding of those who had glimpsed the truth of his life, it all lingered like a gentle warmth. And he knew that he didn't need anything more. Some truths are powerful because they exist quietly. Some heroes are remembered not for the stories they tell, but for the lives they've touched in silence. He had been one of those heroes. He still was, in his own way. And now, finally, he could rest with the knowledge that he was understood, respected, and free to continue the life he had chosen. A life simple, ordinary, human, and real. Peace, he realized, is not loud. It is quiet, subtle, and profound. And in that quiet, he had found it.